I can totally give a talk without slides, I think, but it would be more useful if I did have some slides, actually. Yes. So maybe just a few things before we start, while this issue is being solved. Now, this talk is mostly about the lessons we learned among the journey of 18 months or so. So we've been working on the redesign of the site, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with Smashing Magazine? Oh, many of you. So it's an online magazine for designers and developers, not a big deal, but it turned out to be a really big deal for us from a technical perspective and from the design perspective. So it used to be kind of a mess. When we started out, it was in September 2006, we just picked a random WordPress theme, and here we go, we just started publishing. So as you can imagine, the WordPress theme, common WordPress issues that arise over time. Once you start getting traffic, you need to think about the architecture, you need to think about Nginx and varnish and caching and things like that. Traditional LAMP stack. And over time, we evolved, and so we set up new products. So we had a shop for selling our products, which would then run on Magento first and then on Shopify. We had a job board, which was kind of running as a customized job board built for us, specifically running on Ruby on Rails at the time. And we also had a couple of other things running in the background, all on different platforms. And the problem that we encountered over time is not only maintenance, as most of you will know, but also the main issue was that we wanted to introduce that new thing, the new product that would become a center of the Smashing universe, if you like. And it was called, or it's supposed to be called, the membership, where if you subscribe, you're getting discounts on books and conferences and get access to certain things and so on and so forth. But the problem that we actually had there, it had to become the center of everything. Right? So we had to bridge the gap somehow between different channels. So if you are signed in a job board, in the membership, you have to be able to sign out with the checkout, the shop and the job board without having to log in every single time on every different platform. You know this experience, of course. And so we wanted to build a unique, uniform platform that would enable us to do it. And in the past, we used, again, mostly LAMP stack. And we were playing with this idea of having the Jamstack, or playing with the Jamstack. How many of you have heard of Jamstack? Oh, not that many. Interesting. And it was surprisingly, it was working really, really well. So at this point, if we're looking at the lessons that we learned over the last 18 months or so, it's like a very short summary of the talk, I guess. If you look at the lessons we learned, we just removed the servers altogether. Instead of actually having a PHP and LAMP, the entire thing, running in the background, causing eventually something like WordPress error establishing database connection that many of you might have seen before, we thought we don't need it anymore. What if every single thing that we have, every job posting, every comment, every article, every conference, every speaker, every talk, everything is saved as a Markdown file? That Markdown file will be, of course, well structured. So we run a pre-built process based on Hugo, and we basically compile into HTML, adding some critical CSS on top for performance, and we just push it to a CDN, and we serve straight from a CDN. Right? We don't really need a server. Why would we need a server? And of course, if we need some dynamic content, like let's say comments, search, and so on, we can just enrich whatever we have with the sophisticated JavaScript APIs or custom APIs that we built and open source later, and here we go. We don't really need a server. And I was really amazed about the performance impact that this decision had. Just by moving to the stack and moving away from the server, we actually increased in speed by 5 times. And we actually start render at this point, if you are on a good connection, let's say somewhere in the US somewhere, we start render under 0.5 seconds. And don't get me wrong, it's not like a static page. It's actually a server, well, it's an SPA. It's a single page application. Or to be honest, it's like a bundle of single page applications. But I'm yet to see a SPA that starts render under 0.5 seconds. And if you're on, let's say, on a mid-range device, somewhere on a fast 3G, you'll still start render under 0.9 seconds or so. Just because we heavily invested into that CDN that actually works really well. Kind of basically eliminating the server altogether, well, the traditional server. And so this was kind of one of the main lessons that we learned along the way. They can really boost up your performance. And of course, if you combine it with all the fancy things like progressive web app, service workers, HTTP2, server push, and all of the stuff that you might have heard of, well, that gives you a boost that you can only think of. And one of the things that was really, really important for us, actually, was really thinking about how service workers are going to deal with the delivery of our content. Now, how many of you have or are using a service worker already? Only 2. That's not okay. Well, 2.5. That's not okay, because actually, if you think about the service worker and what they can provide you, there is no way an offline experience can be slower than any network activity, obviously, right? So whenever we use a service worker by basically caching, hard caching everything we can, not necessarily what we need, but everything we can. It would be SVG, CSS, JavaScript, article, like homepage, front page, the category page, and things like that. And it all goes straight to the cache, which is why, of course, the delivery of the assets, because it's coming from a service worker, is very, very fast, which is why we're managing to get under 0.5 second start render time, right? Well, at this point, it would be useful to have slides, I think. But that was kind of one of the really major things that we really worked for us. And of course, we need to think about the users that we have, and we have people like you coming to the site. Yes, I think I see something happening. People like you coming to the site. So it's very likely, yes, fantastic. Oh, it's a bit skewed, but that's okay. And of course, we didn't have to worry too much about IE or to worry too much about all the browsers, because we have people like you attending the site. So we could play with all the fancy technologies and front-end techniques that I'm going to show you next. So this is kind of a story of a Big Bang redesign. But more specifically, what I want to focus is how we kind of moved away from this, which was a legacy site, where it was really hard to feature that prominent new thing that we were evolving or developing into something that looks like this. But okay, if you don't like red, and I'm sure that most of you will not like red, you can turn it off if you want to. That's fine. It will be all good. Now, this talk, or this case study, basically consists of 4 parts. And I'm not going to focus too much on design, because I know most of you are developers. But I'm showing this because if you have a question about the design process, we can talk about it later as well. So what I want to look into in detail is what we did on the front-end side. And of course, it all started again with the main problem. And the main problem is not people like you, although it's kind of related to people like you. The main problem is, of course, ad blockers, the heavy debate going on right now, right? Now, how many of you are using an ad blocker? Who have a good conscience using an ad blocker? Well, most of us. Don't get me wrong, I'm using an ad blocker as well. And there is a good reason for it. Right? But what it meant for us, of course, was a financial outcome, or the financial implications of ad blockers or ad blocker users. Specifically looking, of course, in advertising, we had to realize that every single year for the last 5 years, we've seen a decline of 50% of ad revenue month after month. Well, year after year in total, but month after month, you would see the spike going down and down all the time. That was like a big deal, because at this point, 5 years later, we're at 1/16 of the ad revenue that we used to be 5 years ago, with a pretty stable, quite the same level of traffic. Right? So that was like a big deal. And the other thing is, at this point, 66% of our users, and tendency going towards 70%, is blocking ads. Right? Basically giving us a very clear message, we don't want ads. And it's not like it's a conscious decision. Very often you just turn it on and then you just keep it be, which is a perfectly valid thing. But the question that we ask ourselves now, if most people are using ad blockers, or most people don't see the ads, what's the point of serving them to the minority of our users, right? It might vary, of course, to different publications, to different websites, but in our case it was quite noticeable. Now, we had to kind of move away and do something because advertising wasn't working. And the idea was, why if we kill ads? What if we just remove them altogether? We don't need them, so this is why we thought about actually bringing this new product that we wanted to highlight. It had to become a center of everything. As a result, we had to build up something brand new from scratch to create a tool for the magazine, a CMS for 2,500 articles, comments engine, an e-commerce platform, a subscription service, a job board, and a membership login and authentication from scratch. From scratch. Right? Which was kind of an undertaking. So we got to work. We brought up some people on the team. We worked with this just in the beginning with just one designer and one front-end developer, then with another front-end developer, then with another front-end developer, and then it kept going and going and going. And our cat illustrator, I will tell you the story about it later, because we have 67 cats scattered all over the scattered all over the site. He dreams in cats probably at this point. And I'm showing these people because I'm here presenting, but they're the ones doing hard work. So they should be on stage and not me. But there are many, many people involved. And actually, we wanted to launch like 1 year ago in September for our 10th anniversary. And then we thought maybe we can launch for our 11th anniversary when we haven't launched yet. So, but we are going to launch next week, actually. So that's pretty much good news. So looking again at the site and looking at the work that we did, first we had to look at the browser state support. And this looked pretty, nice. How many of you are using Edge? 2, 3, okay. We don't see a lot of traction of people kind of using Edge. It's a bit sad, but it feels like in many ways people actually, the first thing that people, like users do on Edge is download Chrome, which makes me very sad actually, because Edge is a fantastic browser. And the same way I see a lot of people moving away from Firefox towards Chrome. And it looks like people who are using Safari, they're stuck forever with Safari. They're never going to go away. I would love them to move, okay, this is different. I shouldn't do that publicly, okay? We can talk about it later. But it looked very nice, right? This is like a dream stats that you might only, dream of. It was wonderful. It's like a wonderland where you can play with all the fancy technology. But of course, we have to talk about the other ones, right? But it looked pretty nice. Right? Not that bad. And look into the date. It was December 2015, and of course IE11 has been dropping, although it's a bit stable, but it's like 1.5 at this point. IE8 is almost, well, I don't care about IE8. Well, we don't have to worry about it too much. And mobile is approximately 20% at this point. Although that's not quite true, because we still have one person who comes to it smashing every year or two with an user engine being Internet Explorer 666. It totally skews my stats at the end of the year, but I kind of really appreciate this kind of mind game here, right? So, nice landscape to work from. And we got to work, and I don't know if you have seen this before. This is coming from Peter Toland, who built up this pyramid of needs. We're all familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is a hierarchy of needs for web developers, if you like. So now we write components, be it React components, Angular, doesn't matter. Whenever we write components, we would always think about building things in that order. When we take care of the speed, creating the fastest, leanest thing we can. It has to be kept accessible, right? And then we start thinking about responsiveness, and then eventually we start thinking about web fonts and animations and logos and brandings and all the whistles and bells, right? So in many ways, we kind of really took it on and said, when we build a component, the first, let's say, CSS properties will be related to speed, then access, then scale, then style. Right? So it's been very fundamental for us, but it's a very simple framework, but was very, very helpful as well. And it was all about components, of course. And one of the first sketches that we actually came up with looked something like this. And the first thing that you always set up, I think at this point, because we were all creating components and modular-based systems, we would actually start building some sort of standalone components and setting up style guides, pattern libraries, identifying patterns, giving name to patterns, and things like that, right? How many of you have built or are building a pattern library at this point? Or design system, or style guide, something of that kind? Well, some people who, okay, here's a question for you. For how many of you is that pattern library that you're building or have built recently still up to date today? 1.5 people, 1.75. It's very hard to keep it up to date. And in fact, I must admit that ours is not quite up to date, but we are almost there, right? But we don't have that many components. So if we look into the things we built, it looked pretty simple. There is nothing too fancy going on, right? But it was really important to kind of keep it as a place to reference. When we started working on the site, very often you will get some wireframes, or you will get some sketches or something to start working. We had a slightly different approach, because this is how I like working. And so for me personally, when it comes to the creative process, be it designers or developers, I always start with text. And so I would write down the components in plain text in my text editor. Just literally writing them down to understand what I need. And more specifically, I would also write down the interface copy of how we're going to communicate to our users, right? So it's a lot about interface copy at this point, and I'm really identifying what the components are going to be. And also, later, giving names to these components before we actually start prototyping them. Now that's been really, really helpful, because it really sets up the expectations right, and also everybody on the team will have will have a say about how the things are going to be named. It's not coming just for front-end developers who just write CSS or JavaScript. So even things like micro-interactions like a light box could be prototyped this way. But as you can see here, it's quite generic. It's pretty much the copy you will find everywhere. So very quickly, I decided to move away from this towards creating something a bit more, well, less generic. We talk a lot about everything looking the same on the web today. Everything is being very, very similar, and we actually wanted to avoid this because it was also about finding our own personality and defining what our branding perception will be. When we started working like in the user interviews and started asking people, so how do you perceive Smasher magazine? Many people wouldn't say things like professional, respected publication. They wouldn't say things like fast, performance-oriented, web community leader, or things like that. But they would say things like friendly, open-minded. And they would say sometimes things like cats. And the reason for cats is because we have a couple of conferences every year. We have to promote every single conference. Every single conference has a cat mascot. So, you know, instead of saying professional publication, people are saying things like cats. I don't like cats. Who is a cat person? Who is a dog person? Who doesn't really care? Okay, according to my scientific survey, approximately 30% are cat people, 40% are dog people, and everybody else just doesn't care. So it's too late for us because we have cats now. But once we had this idea that we maybe should just embrace the way people see us, we thought, let's just really embrace it. So the first thing I started working on was not necessarily, beside the components, was actually working on the error messages, right? And you might wonder, well, it's very weird once you see it outside of the context of the site. But it was really important to catch up the person, like get the person when they're the most annoyed. When are they most annoyed? When they have an error message, where they just missed something or made a mistake or so. If you can make them smile at the point when it really matters, you can actually turn it into a very nice experience. And once we have that, I started looking through the typeface, pick that one, and then that one, and I really don't like it. Like, look at this A. I mean, if you're a designer, you will just, what the hell is happening here? But it felt right because it really fits with the personality we developed. And then as a result, with all these cats, like all over the place at our conferences, we thought, okay, well, then be it cats. Why not? So we have many, 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 many different cats, right? And it was also about finding the right angle for the layout, for example, and finding our signature that would make us unique. So one of the things that we developed quite quickly was our own way of saying things and our way of presenting things. We tried different layouts, and we just built them very quickly. There was just really hacky, dirty CSS, well, usually with Flexbox, but recently with CSS grid layout, as I will get into it in a second. But we then found that if we look at the logo is tilted, and it was tilted by 10.6 degrees. And the first thing we did was the major redesign of the logo. Well, it was tilted by 10.6, now it's tilted by 11 degrees. It's a big deal for us, very big deal for us. But we thought maybe everything could be tilted. Every single thing could be tilted, including this mock-up here, right, where you see the avatar at the top and the drop caps, and other things. So this has become kind of our signature, which eventually led us to, of course, like micro interactions like this with a shadow and things, and eventually brought us to layout, which looks like this, right? And I'm sure that most of you will hate it because the major part of the screen is basically blocked by the author. But I think it's really important because very often they're just little bylines somewhere at the bottom of the page. So it's better to give them, at least to me, to give them more presence than too little, too much presence than too little. And also the forms, by the way, just in case you're wondering, of course, are tilted as well, because why not? But of course, once you tap on it or hover on it, it will be untilted. And it has a lot of, as you can see maybe, a lot of those things like interface copy things which were decided very early on, before the visual design was developed at all. And that includes, of course, the direction, because it had to be consistent. So this animation had to be happening from that degree as well. And the wording in there had to be kind of, had to work and fit in with whatever we're creating. But once we had the layout, we had to ask ourselves, so how are we going to build it, right? And actually, to be honest, media queries is not a big deal. So what's so weird about responsive object design and everything? But I didn't want to use media queries. And you might be wondering, what the hell? What did media queries do now? There's nothing wrong with media query, right? But the thing is, whenever we use too many media queries, I always run into maintenance issues. And of course, many of you, if you're writing front-end, you will be using Sass or less or stylus or whatever it is. But the problem, and you have the parameters, the variables, and you can adjust it, but you still have to make changes. Every time you really make a big change, you really have to touch that media query, because it gives us access to the global scope and not to the local scope. So if we could avoid media queries, I thought, maybe we can actually be better off, because we always have to fight this kind of continuum. If you're getting a mock-up from the designer, right, you're getting this perfect, or like more or less perfect screen on smaller screens, and then you get a perfect screen for desktop or large screens, and then you have to interpolate in between. And this is what it's going to look like. Because it's not like you're given the perfect mock-up for every single scenario. As developers, we have to interpolate between two different states in a predictable manner, according to designer's intent. And that's very, very hard. Because eventually, things start shifting or moving around, or they're not perfect. So what do? You either ask a designer or you do something. And we wanted to avoid this kind of unpredictability because we wanted to build fast. And this brought us to this idea of fluid sizing that some of you might have heard of before. Now, again, this is the layout we ended up with, which was kind of a nightmare to build in the first place. But the way it was built was kind of different, not in the traditional way as we usually do it. So if you want to create scalable components, the idea being, let's imagine you have a component, right? And it would define the function that would actually, or you would write the function that would define the behavior of that component on a smaller screen, larger screen, and so on in between. But you want to define it once, and it would do magically what you want for you. So Simurai wrote once that if you want to efficiently scale up and scale down a component, there's a very simple technique for it, right? If you look at the front-end side, it's simple, right? If you want to build something like this, you would say, okay, I'm going to put font size, let's say, in rem units on the body, on the root's font size, root of that component, and everything inside of that component is going to be defined in M units, right? Do you know what I'm talking about here? How many of you are writing front-end every day? Okay, so you put the root in rems, so it gives you the reference to the body font size, and then you put everything inside of that component in M units, so it refers to the root, well, to the rem unit, right? So if you scale up the rem by changing the font size, let's say from 2 rems to 2.5, everything is going to scale up, right? Oh, that's nice, because you end up with this, instead of actually fiddling with the radius and thinking about the radius and the padding and the margin and the color and whatever. You just go ahead and say, I'm just changing the font size on the root, and it's done. Just wrap it inside of a media query, and it's done. But I didn't want to use a media query. That's the thing. So I thought maybe we could actually get away from this. Because normally, if you think about the behavior of that component, we don't want this. Let's say think about H1, a heading, right? You don't want it to become very, very small in the beginning and then grow, I don't know, becoming 200 pixels on large screens. You want to have a very predictable growth, much more like this, where it starts growing at some point, right here, right? And then it stops growing at some point, right? Because otherwise the lines will become too lengthy, or the padding will be too big, and things like that. Which brings us to this idea of how we can map it. Now, if you map the breakpoints, or the viewport, and the font sizes of a heading next to each other, right? So you have, let's say, a dot over here. You have 22 pixels at around 550 pixels, and you have 24 pixels at around 790, and so on and so forth. And if you map it and try to kind of approximate it, you will end up with this kind of curve, right? I have a warning for you. Math is coming. So if you want to describe this curve, and this is the idea that I had in the first place, you would need to solve something like this in CSS. That's hard. It's almost impossible to solve it in CSS. But this is the idea. You define the curve once, and it's going to be right everywhere. That would be quite wonderful, right? Well, you can't do that. That's just not possible. The only thing you can do is kind of approximate it somehow. And of course, you can go ahead and break down that thing into 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 lines, and then describe every single line by calculating the slope and the font size and the y-intercept and all this stuff. But, you know, who wants to do that? Right? We ended up doing it from the beginning, but it felt weird, because you end up with really magical numbers all over the place. So that's weird, because actually what you need to do then is calculate this. Okay? Still with me? You can't do that in Calc. There is no way you can do it with CSS. Right? So I thought, okay. Well, basically we want something very simple. I mean, it shouldn't be that hard to build something like this without media queries. right? You start growing somewhere, you stop growing. You start growing, and you stop growing. Shouldn't be that hard, right? So there is a formula that kind of does what you want. And this is what it is. So like imagine, again, combining it with that font size that I was talking about in the beginning with rem units. If you put it on the container, let's say on a component's root, you actually get what you want. So how does it work? Now, many of you are familiar with calc, right? And use calc maybe. How many of you have seen this formula before? A few people, not many. So it's actually quite simple if you start really digging into it. So you have this 16 pixels thing, right? Which is kind of the minimum that you have for that component. And then to it, you add some sort of a weight, if you like. Now, to do it 24 minus 16 is the difference between the maximum and the minimum font size. And then you multiply it with the space that you can't grow over using VW. How many of you are familiar with VW units? So 1 VW is 1% of the viewport width. 1 VH is 1% of the viewport height. So you basically here calculate how much space you have left to grow over. Right? And then you divide it by the difference between the maximum screen size and minimum screen size where your breakpoints live. Right? And you kind of define the growth from 16 pixels to 24 within the breakpoint range between 400 to 800. But you can, of course, go from 0 pixels to 1,600 pixels if you want to. But I want a predictable growth starting somewhere, at this point at 400, and stopping somewhere, at this point 800, growing from 16 to 24. Well, you can get away with this. You can, of course, plug in a media query if you want to, but you can have this kind of fluid experience, fluid modular scale, without media queries. You just write all the time according to this scale, or according to this function that you define, right? And just in case you're wondering, calc is well supported, except Opera Mini, but we're used to it at this point, and the fallback for it would be, of course, pixels. Or M units for Opera, right? And think about it not just as a single problem or single solution to a very single specific problem. What if you applied this kind of thinking everywhere? On paddings, on borders, on margins, on width, on height, and everything that's size related. Because that's what we ended up doing. The same thing goes for line height. You don't want to write 1.3 line height here and 1.5 line height over there. You want to define it once and for all. You don't want this. You want a controllable growth, automatic controllable growth. The same story. You start at 1.3, you finish at 1.5, and you want to grow between 21 amps and 35 amps. You plug it in the formula, which looks exactly like the previous one, and you end up with this. You can, of course, refine it with media queries if you want to, but you don't have to. It just automatically grows if it needs to, and then it stops growing. And it could go further, like you can think about creating some sort of dynamic layouts where padding and spacing and everything is kind of fluid in a way. It's a kind of a new way of defining fluidity. But there are two ways of defining it, the scary one and not so scary one. Now, what if you put that formula, that calc thing, on the body font size or HTML font size? Which means that if everything in here defined using rem units, it will always scale up and down beautifully, right? But if you have something like a fixed add unit or something that's fixed, you need to create a fixed container, define it in pixels, and everything inside can be defined using M units. And you end up with this kind of experience. Everything is fluid, but that thing remains fixed, right? That's one of the things that you might need to accommodate for. Another thing is, what if we turn it around? We do whatever we always did, right? HTML font size 100%, as we always did. And then here we can turn on or create a fluid behavior in a fluid container, right? So here we're defining this container. It could be like article, for example. This is what we ended up doing. Then you have this formula, whatever you define in there, and everything inside of that container is defined using M units, right? That's what we ended up using as well. And you end up with this, right? Well, if you need, if you look at the big font size here, the thing, then it kind of scales up and scales down, but everything else is kind of more or less fixed. I mean, it's fluid, but the font size is fixed, right? So if we look now into the layout, the entire layout is built exactly this way. Every single thing, the border, the spacing, the width, the height, the SVG icon in the right upper corner, the border around it, the padding around it, the font size of the text around it, every single thing is defined using calc. Right? And I mean, we did use some media queries here and there because we have a switch, like a really important breakpoint coming up, where the position of the layout or the position of things is changing, right? But every single thing is kind of defined using that calc thing alone, right? Which also means that we ended up kind of simplifying things, to be honest. So we ended up creating or having this kind of declarations, right? Where it feels like magic numbers sometimes because they're experimental numbers that we just tested and see, is it good enough? Is it good enough? Does it grow well enough? Does it grow well enough or not, right? You might be wondering, so does it have any implications in terms of rendering? Well, everything has to be recalculated every time you resize. So when you hit the page, it's calculated once. But if you keep resizing, yes, it is noticeable, right? But we're not optimizing for people who do this. We're optimizing people who read, right? So it kind of works, and maintenance-wise, it's really wonderful because it actually does exactly what we need to. Now, another thing that we actually really liked was this idea of namespacing. Do you use namespacing in CSS? A couple of people, 4. Well, I want everybody to use it. Now, namespacing is really, really powerful. Why? Now, some of you might have been in the situation in the past where you're getting CSS from somebody else, and then you're like, okay, so I don't know what this does. I don't know where else it's used. I don't know if I can delete it. I don't know if I can change it. I don't know if I can use it elsewhere. I just don't know anything. I have to dig in and spend some time to really understand what's going on behind the hood, right? So what if every single class, every single component had a prefix in front of it? That's a very simple idea, and many of you will be using it anyway in software development. So for example, for something like big objects, or like mostly structural objects, like a media object, illustration and text, you would use O, which is stands for object, right? You can also use L, that stands for layout. You can use C, stands for components, smaller components, like an accordion, for example, things like that. Th, or everything related to theme, goes with the prefix T. Everything that's in scope inside of a CMS can go with an S. Then you can also have state hooks, like is open, is closed, has dropped down, this kind of things, is visible, and so on and so forth. Utilities, like clear fixes and all the horrible things that we need sometimes, they could have this prefix U, and it keeps going and going and going. And we ended up creating a lot of custom things as well, just because they're related to a very particular thing, like webinars or books and things like that, right? And it makes writing CSS, or writing HTML even, really much more pleasant because you know exactly what you're dealing with, right? And of course, if you're using BAM convention or anything BAM-alike, are you using BAM or BAM-alike something? Some of you. Then it just makes it very clear by just looking at the code what is happening behind the scenes, right? And this is what it will look like, but the best thing is that you can also highlight some of the things then with CSS as well. You can say, I want to see all the particular components and objects and utilities and hacks that I'm using just by using outline, just by using a bit of CSS. If you need to refactor something, you can also use some kind of RF classes, for example, to do the same thing, right? So we ended up using quite a lot, although I wouldn't say we still do have to refactor some things at this point. But what's really nice is you can have RF classes there as well, where you can say, I need to refactor something, so I'm going to prefix it with RF. So then, by having something like this, you could say, please outline everything that we already done, that we haven't done yet, that has a prefix RF, has to be refactored. So you get this wonderful outline, or highlight everything that has been refactored already. So it is not RF, right? And this is the work that you did, right? Even better, you can think about the idea of responsive suffixes, where in your classes in HTML, you could write things like this. So imagine you have a component that is an image list in the small screens. On a large screen, it turns into a carousel. With JavaScript, obviously, right? So we can even do things like this. So just by looking at the code, you know exactly what is happening behind the scenes. Okay, it's going to be on a small screen, it's going to be image list, and it's going to be carousel on large screens, and then for CSS, you will be using this, you just need to escape the @ symbol, right? Now, we did not use it, but I thought it was really, really interesting to see it happening. When it comes to naming things, in the past, I used to be very specific, and much of the code that I wrote for the new site was too specific, so I have to actually refactor it. But there are some things I learned along the way. Now, if you're writing CSS today, some of you might have seen something like this. Instead of using IDs, we'll be using a lot of classes, and we'll be using classes that stand for specific purposes. So you would say things like this, or this kind of syntax. BAM standing for block element modifier, which kind of defines relationships between different modules. So here, by let's say looking at this this thing over here, which is a P paragraph, if it was just a P, you wouldn't know potentially what you're looking at or like what styles are applied to it. But here, just by looking at the class, maybe in DevTools, you see, okay, its parent is C card, it's a component card, so it's a very clear relationship to it. And if you have a different paragraph, which is maybe blue, you can just add a modifier, hyphen, and then blue. Right? So it really creates this kind of establishes relationships. There are many different things, or many different ways of naming things. This is just the one that we're using. But there is one thing that I learned. So, I mean, it's probably quite trivial, but it was really important for me because I had to rethink a lot of the stuff that we were building. So if you have this kind of relationship, it feels very easy to go ahead and say, okay, this button lives in this container, and it's a C button, and it lives in C card, so I'm going to call it C card __ C button, so I know exactly the relationship. But then it makes it not reusable, right? Because it really needs this context for that button to appear again. So it's really important, well, it's been important for me to just kind of really think about what purpose does this component stand for, and what's so different about it. So instead of writing something very specific like this, I would write something like this, right? Because, you know, if it has particular features, I can actually maybe break them down, and I can reuse this class, and I can reuse this class later, right? I mean, it probably sounds very obvious for me, but actually it really meant that we had to rewrite again some of the CSS that we wrote. And the same goes for deep nesting. I've seen some code where you would see things like this happening, right? Where you would have sometimes two underscores to really explicitly define that behavior. But is it really needed? Do you really need to know exactly what is happening behind the scenes for every single thing, for every single label? Maybe even things like this would be easier, where you say, okay, I have one component, right, and then I have another component, a smaller one, just really breaking it down, making it as small as possible, right? That was the thing that was really kind of tough for me to grasp. And of course, we thought, let's do grid. I mean, many of you might have heard of CSS grid layout at this point. CSS grid layout, anybody? Right? How many of you are using it in production? A few people, right? So starting from March this year, Grid has landed in production in all the major browsers, and it's really important because unlike Flexbox, which went through series of iterations, series of different syntaxes and things like that, with prefixes and all this stuff, it's never going to happen again. Because at this point, browser implementers are always talking about the new specifications and bring them into browsers behind flags, so you can play with them if you want to, and then they agree, okay, it's going to go live in March or April. And so at this point, we're like at 80% penetration of CSS grid support, which is fantastic. So you can create layouts like this without too much hassle. If you think about even layouts like this, which you might or might not want to or need to build, right? But it really shows you the power of CSS grid layout because it's really easy. And you might get scared by saying things like this about the potential of CSS grid layout. This is not a good way to describe how awesome CSS grid layout is. It really scares people, at least the ones that I'm talking to most of the time. Because actually, if you think about it, it's very simple. It's much simpler than Flexbox. You just need some time to really get the idea behind it. But it's really simple. You need maybe like 15 minutes to really get the idea behind it. So here's an example for it. And this is, by the way, the browser support. Now, this is like a 5-minute crash course into CSS grid layout. Now, in CSS grid layout, we have grid lines, which are kind of the lines that separate different columns in a grid. We have also grid track, which is basically just a space between two grid lines. And then we also have a grid cell, which is, as you can see, accompanied by 4 grid lines, just like a table cell. And then you can also have a grid area, right? Now, there are a couple of things you need to know. When you define a grid, you define it using grid template columns and grid template rows. You can literally say how many columns you need, you can say how many rows you need, or it will automatically fill it in for you. Now, if you want to define a grid which contains 4 columns, and you want to have, let's say, a main content area occupying, let's say, 3 columns, and then the last column being a sidebar, you say grid template columns, display grid on the container first, and then grid template columns, I need 4 columns, each 250 pixels. Or you can rephrase it by saying, I don't want to write all of them individually. I'm just going to write repeat 4 times 250 pixels. You can repeat not only one value, but even any pattern. So if you need something like this, 1 fraction unit, 2 fraction units, which is very much like in Flexbox, where you distribute shares, it's the same way. So it's like take, 1 fraction unit is 1 share of the available space, right? So if you're creating 5 times 1 fraction unit times 2 fraction units, you end up with how many columns? Right, 10 columns. 5 of them are going to have 1 fraction unit, 5 of them are going to have 2 fraction units, which means 5 times 1 plus 5 times 2 ends up being 15 shares. Right? Okay, but you will get the idea in a second. So this is how you can actually define a layout very easily and then put columns or put content next to those grid lines, so on the grid rows or grid columns, right? And there are a couple of other things, but the important thing is maybe let's just jump into the demo to show how it actually works. So this is what we had to build. So we had the thing where the content is breaking out of the layout, right? So you have the content column, and then you have this advertising unit or so that wants to occupy all of the space. Now, how can you do it? Now, let's maybe take a slightly more abstract perspective. Now, you might have this, right? Some of you might have seen this problem before. Now, there is a very lazy way of doing it, and there is a very not so lazy way of doing it, right? You can say, okay, I have my container, and in that container, everything lives. The image, the text, and everything. And if I have an image like this, I'm just going to close the container and put an image and reopen it again, right? This is how developers go, like they do this, then they go home, they drink and fall asleep, and the next day it starts again. Please don't do that. That will give you nightmares. That's not cool, because we can do it much better. There are options. So to release our child element from its container, we just need to know how much space there is between the container edge and the viewport edge. And this is where we can use calc. Now what do we need to do? Now if we look again into this thing here, now there are a couple of things going on here. Right? So if we look at this content and we look into the full width, this is the full container, right? Now if we need to push this image out, we just need how much we need to push it out. Now, it's basically by this part to the left and by this part to the right, right? And why is that, and how can we calculate it? Well, we just need to calculate what we have. Now we have the content, area content container, right? This is like our 100%. And we have the viewport width, which is our 100 VW. So you just push it to the left with minus 50 VW plus 50% of the container. And you do the same thing on the right, and you're kind of done, really. You just need to know how much you need to push it. You just need to give it a special class, like QRelease or so, utility release, and then you're done, right? However, every time you use viewport width, you might end up with things like this, a scroll bar, the never going away scroll bar. And the reason for it is because whenever you use a viewport width, it does not account for the width or the height of a scroll bar, which is super, super annoying. It's like box sizing content box all over again. So sad. But you can actually get away with it by saying, I can just put overflow X hidden and call it a day and go home and drink. Don't do that. That will give you nightmares. That's like the patch that you give to your code. That's not cool. So what can we do better? Then, well, you can do the same thing without calc. Then you don't have this problem. Left 50%, right 50%, margin left minus 50 VW, margin right minus 50 VW, and you're done. Right? And there's a nice article actually highlighting this technique as well. But you can do it much better with CSS grid layout. Because if you think about this problem, you can also frame it differently. Now imagine it's the same problem, just slightly differently. Now, this is how we would probably write grid today, because we can't rely on it, because many browsers, well, the browser, you know which browser I'm talking about, will not support it. So we have to write @supports display grid. How many of you are familiar with @supports? So @support is kind of a replacement for Modernizer. It's a feature detection, It's a CSS feature thing in CSS, which allows you to target specific features. Now the problem is, and you can also write, of course, supports not display grid. But the problem is that not supports is not supported in browsers that desperately need support for it. Like, of course, Internet Explorer or so. So not supports doesn't really work, although we desperately need it to work and be supported, which is kind of sad. But overall, @support is actually quite well supported. So that's a good thing. So, but if you want to be future-proof for everything that's coming up next, like all the new fancy technologies that are coming up next, they'll be using this by default, which is why we don't use Modernizer and actually also drop jQuery, but it's a different story. Right? So you don't really need Modernizer anymore today, unless you have to support i8 or i9. which you probably might need to do at some point. So you write just, OK, if you support display grid, I want this container to be displayed as display grid. So it's a grid box, right? And I'm defining the layout now. Grid template columns, I have 3 columns, 1, 2, and 3, and you can use a min-max function to make it responsive or make it fluid. So, I want to grow from 1M to 1 fraction unit. 1 fraction unit behaving very much like flex 1 in Flexbox. So it just takes as much space as it has, but a minimum will be 1 M unit. The same here, between 0 and 40 Ms, probably should be more than 0, but it will be 0 if there is no space, and 40 at most. Right? And then we have, again, min-max between 1 M and 1 fraction unit. It's like a gutter in a responsive grid. Right? And the best thing now is that you can also give names to grid lines. Now imagine you have 3 columns. Right? How many grid lines would you have? Now you would have 4. Why? Imagine if you have 3 columns, like here, right? There is this line. Oh, it's very hard to point. There is one line. Oh, OK, I better do it differently. So whenever we have 3 grid lines, let me just show you what I mean here. It might be better off by showing this monster. So if you have, let's say, just look at this little segment here. We have 1, 2 columns. And we have 1, 2, 3 lines. Right? So whenever you have X columns, you always have X plus 1 lines. And what's really important to understand about grid is that you're positioning content against grid lines, not in the grid columns, but against grid lines. So the way it would work then is this, again, coming back here. You give names to each line, ending up with this. So you have 1, 2, 3 columns, grid line 1, grid line 2, grid line 3, and grid line 4. Right? And then, and that's the magic thing about it, you can actually put content between those lines. I mean, you can also give names to rows if you want to, right? But at this point, it's really, really powerful. Now, why? Now, if you do this, and actually they can also have multiple names, just in case you're wondering, you can just separate them by empty space, and then they can have like 2 names. Because imagine you might have a sidebar starting somewhere, but the main content ending somewhere at the same spot, right? Now, here's the best part. Now, if you do this, in order to define that experience of breaking out, right? Well, what do? Well, you say all the content in the container is going to go into main, which is the area which is scoped between main start and main end. So it's going to go right here, and everything like the image that we want to give like due release class, it's going to go into full. So it's going to accommodate, like fill in the entire space going from here all the way to here. And you're done. And many problems that you have in front end today, like layout specific, can be solved in a very simple way with grid layout, right? Do you understand what I'm doing here? So you give names to these lines and you position content against lines. Now, no media query is needed, and that's really powerful. Why? Because you can go ahead and put it not only like this, because obviously that's going to work, right? But you can also put this container anywhere on the page and it's still going to work, right? Because it doesn't really rely on viewport width or viewport height. It doesn't rely on a media query. So if you have a sidebar at some point, you plug it in, that container, and it looks at the available shares and distributes space in the same way, right? You have something else, maybe some strange padding or something, it's still going to work. It gives you access to the local scope that we actually want in the first place. Right? And of course, there are many ways of how you can reuse it as well. So even creating layout like this is super simple. You just need to say, okay, this content is going to be aligned to the bottom. You can use all the justify items properties and align items that we know from Flexbox, and you can align to the bottom, and then this thing is going to flow over here. And imagine if you, with a media query, if you change the order of the component, right, it will still flow in the right thing. It's like CSS regions, just much more restricted, which I think is pretty cool, right? So that's layout thing, but we also have something else that's really, really super exciting, which is the logic fault that you can create with CSS custom variables, or CSS custom properties. How many of you have heard of CSS variables? Okay, I mean not like Sass variables, but proper CSS, native CSS variables, right? So they're called CSS custom properties, and the reason for it, because they don't have to be just variables. And there are a couple of things you can do with them too. Now with CSS custom properties, and I really like this idea coming from Mike Friedman from Australia, he said that we can now finally separate the logic from design, effectively separating variable declarations from property declarations in CSS by also creating live variables, which is really, really interesting. And when talking about live variables, he was speaking specifically about some sort of, variable expressions. Now, there's a big difference between Sass variables and CSS variables. And the reason is this. All variable expressions and calc statements that use CSS custom properties will be recalculated or adjusted or refined when the variable is redefined. If you have a media query which redefines that property that you have defined once, then the layout will change as well. It's not possible with Sass. In Sass, you just define it statically and you're done after it's all compiled. Now, with here, we have dynamic variables, so if something changes in your design, or if the media query kicks in, you can actually redefine the entire thing, cascade down the line, cascade down the DOM, which is really interesting. So, unlike preprocessors, they have knowledge of the DOM and can be scoped to DOM elements. So this is what you can do with custom variables. This is what they look like. They're also very, very simple. You just define a variable, like at the top, right? Say I have a grid gutter 1 rem, right? And then you can redefine it if you want to, and say I want to scope it to root here, right? So if I have at least 600 pixels, my grid gutter is going to be 1.25. Because for mobile, I want to make it a bit bigger. And then you have your grid layer. So this is basically where the logic lives. And here you just say, OK, I use the grid gap, whatever I have defined. And then I can use the margin, and I use the margin left and margin right. And it lives separately. So it acts for everything. And the logic is defined at the top. So making this kind of a logic fold, right? And you can do everything with it, whatever you need. You can even cascade it down if you want to. So you can say, maybe I'll just jump to the example here. So you kind of get the idea. You can define a color, for example, and then if for a media query, you can redefine it. Or if it's a dark theme, you can redefine it. And then it's actually redefined for the entire experience. And if you manage to change it, like with a media query, for example, it can affect the entire cascade down the line. And so if you need to convert your Unitless values, like what you usually do with Sass, well, you define these variables at the top. And then in order to convert, you just need to use calc and multiply it with whatever value you need, like 1 pixel, 1 rem, 1 m unit, and so on and so forth. And you kind of have it too. Right? I have 1 minute, but I have too many slides to go. So let's see when they kick me out. We have lunch anyway. So, sorry. Now here's an example of where we use it. Now we have these boxes. So if you're signed in as a member, there are different activities for different kind of customers. Right? So if you're a supporter, you're getting something. If you're like a member, and so on and so forth. And so they have different background color, but everything is kind of similar in a way. So this is the logic behind it. Right? So we have this LI for members, for supporters, and so on and so forth. Right? And in CSS, this is how it looks like. Now, obviously, all of them are promo boxes. So we're defining this logic once. If we have a high contrast, because we have a color switcher, contrast switcher, we can redefine box color. And then you can combine it with Sass. You can say, well, I'm going to use, box background is going to be lightened by green, right? But only for members who are not supporters, because we have 3 levels, supporters, members, and then premium, whatever, right? So you need to be of that level in order to get it, right? And we do the same for other classes as well. So that thing is kind of the logic that lives above the CSS. And then for the CSS, for the particular label, for example, we're just using taking whatever color has been decided on the top, right? And the same goes for the box, where we can combine it with the background color as well. And you can also use all the other things as well. And you can really plug it in, right? Oh, at this point it's actually wrong because it's supposed to be the hex value. You can't use RGBA on it. But you can just plug it in. And it can be also any string that you like as well, which is pretty cool. And if you this is really kind of just redefining this property. But if you think about how you would do this, if you want to achieve an effect, a visual effect like this, how would you actually do it? Any guesses? Who wants to leave at this point? Okay, some people. So it was a little bit tricky because I obviously don't want to use JavaScript for it and some heavy animations and things. So I thought, I can just fake it. So here's how it goes. You have this box, right? And this box has a background, which is a linear gradient. And it goes from left to right. And the first 50% of the gradient is gray, which is the gray that you see there. And then The other 50% is whatever color I defined in the logic fold. All right? And then the only thing I do is, well, I use a background size 200%. So it's like this one is 100% by default at first. And this one is also 100%. And then on hover, I'm just shifting it all off with minus 100%, like moving away from this back to here. This is the only part that I have left, right? Because I'm pushing by 100%. And I also increase the opacity from 0, which is here, to 1, and animate it. And that's it. And you don't need anything else at this point. The trick is, first 100% is, well, because it's 200%, right? The entire background size. First is gray, and then the other one is whatever color you have, and you don't really have to define it anymore. Right? And just in case you're wondering, CSS custom properties are really well supported. No reason not to use them today, except you know who. But we're used to it at this point. We know how to deal with it, right? Just two more things to show you for performance, because we also learned a lot along the way too. Progressive CSS. There was a talk. We talked a lot, mentioned already HTTP2. But HTTP2 was interesting because it really, we asked ourselves, how can we optimize assets delivery best for HTTP2? And there are a couple of options. You can use server push and others. And we ended up with a couple of things. And one particularly interesting thing that we found is critical CSS, or progressive CSS that we ended up using. How many of you have heard of critical CSS or above the fold CSS, this kind of thing? Right? So where you actually push as much as usable CSS and JavaScript if you need to in the header of the page, that the browser can start to render faster. But we asked ourselves, so what would be the best option for doing this? Now, in the past, we used to do this. You just have your CSS, you concatenate everything, you combine everything, you minify, and say, here we go, right? Browser, deal with it. And we moved away from it because it's actually a blocking resource. Now, we didn't want to have any blocking resources at all for render, for start render, right? So we kind of moved away slowly, like a few years ago, towards something like this, where you have these critical styles. So you would have access, you would give access to the full CSS file, but then you would also say, well, if the cookie hasn't been set yet, I'm going to load the critical, like the first 10, 12, 14 kilobyte of CSS, put it right in the header, and then, load the full CSS later. And then we moved away to this in the HTTP2 world, where it's recommended to be using something like this. Because, we have all the components, and we can make use of, parallel downloads at the same time, because it's like one flow in HTTP2 anyway. So let's just push it all. Like side header, of course, all of them will be minified, but we don't have to worry about concatenating all of it. Because then, the best advantage is, if we need to change the sidebar, we change only sidebar, and user has to download only sidebar, right? Everything else is going to remain cached. That sounds good. But then what really worked best was not even this, but this, which is very surprising to me. So when you need something, you call for it. So when you have a header coming up, you request site header CSS. When you have an article coming up, you request article CSS. When you need comments, you request comment CSS right before it. Now, it really doesn't affect full page performance, like load page performance, but it really does have a tremendous effect on the perceived performance. So here is the video comparing the two. So the left with progressive CSS, on the right without. Because obviously CSS is still a blocking resource. The user will not start, the browser will not start render until they actually get full CSS. So here just say, hey, here's a little chunk that you need to render it, go. Here's a little chunk that you need to render it, go. Now it was a bit sad to discover just 1 month ago that while this is remarkably fast in Chrome, something has changed in Firefox. I haven't tested in the last version that came up yesterday, the 57, the Quantum one. I will have to test it. But in Chrome, way faster. In Firefox, way slower. So, but you can actually think about it, because actually you can achieve really, really good results with it. So I will have to check what it looks like in the current version of Firefox. Right? That was very, very powerful. And as for critical CSS, we ended up creating separate pages, so separate criticals, one for every single main category. So this is the site. Yes, I will turn it off. So if you look in here, so we also deal with web fonts and things like that. And here is this critical CSS that we also serve. And you will see it actually quite a lot. Normally, we wouldn't need it, We wouldn't need to need it. We wouldn't need to need it because of server push in HTTP 2, but in our results, server push wasn't as fast as we actually wanted to, which is why we're serving as much as we can right away, and the browser can actually start render it right away as well. And then if you go to an article, right, everything is kind of rendered again with a slightly different critical CSS that we're serving right here, right? So that was kind of interesting. And just the last thing maybe that's also worth looking into is the web font thing. Because in the past, I used to think that dealing with web fonts is easy. But then it turned out it's not that easy, actually. There are many things you have to keep in mind. And there are a couple of strategies of dealing with it, right? If you really want to optimize for it, you will be subsetting your font. You'll be loading the subsetted font first, and then you'll be loading the full web font later, asynchronously with JavaScript. And there is a really nice article about all of this, comprehensive guide to font loading strategies. But I thought, no, we can do better. So I ended up deciding that maybe we need a new acronym in the industry, which I kindly called C2S FOFT RWD URISW. Feel free to tattoo it and memorize it if you need to. It's like a critical two-stage fourth render with data URI. So how does it work? Now we're using service workers to cache as much as we can, right? But the idea is we want the first quick start render. So what if we just load only one font or a subset version of that font, which is going to be Roman, and then we're going to load everything later. And we subset it to the minimum, like A to Z, 0 to 9 punctuation, and we'll load the content in that font right away. And then we'll load everything else asynchronously, put it in the service worker, check then on the first load if it's on the service worker already. If it is, just use it right away, and which delays lasts by maybe 40 to 50 milliseconds. And then just if you don't have it, just go through the same routine again. The only problem is, of course, if you're using service worker, you need to run over HTTPS. It's just not going to work otherwise, right? But apart from that, it works really, really well. And the other thing that we could also use is the CSS font loading API, which you could also go ahead and use today. Where you can define your font face object and be really granular about how the content is going to be rendered. So you can say, well, please try to font Elena regular, which is going to be defined here, right? And if it is loaded, then add a class Elena reg loaded, or if it failed for some reason, add this class failed, right? And once you do it, you can also use fancy new properties. So for example, you say if the font is loaded, then use font family Elena regular, and for example. But you can also get access to font rendering property, which basically lets you define exactly how the content is going to be rendered. You can say, I want the content to be blocked by 0 seconds, and then swap to web fonts. Now why? Because different browsers have very different behaviors when they start render, right? If you go in Chrome and you start render and you have web fonts, what's going to happen is that the fonts cannot load within 3 seconds. They will be falling back to the general fonts, right? And then there will be a switch. You know what I mean by saying switch from fallback to web font? In other browsers, like Safari, you can just wait eternally for fonts to download. They just don't, whatever, I have time. They have nowhere to go, right? So you can be more granular about this experience. You can say, I want it to block and not display any content at all for exactly 0 seconds, which means it's going to be displayed in fallback right away, and then swap and wait infinitely until web fonts get in, right? So whenever fonts come in, just do the switch. But you can also say, I don't want to swap as well. You can also say, I want to block for 3 seconds, like a Chrome experience, right? And then swap swap only if the fonts get in after 3 seconds after this, so after 6 seconds in total, right? And you might wonder, what about browser support? Well, we are used to it again at this point, I guess, but it is coming in Edge as well, so everybody is on board. So this is what we're kind of getting into. Now, there are many things I mentioned here, and you can actually get access to those slides later as well. But I want to wrap up by saying one thing. Now, it was a really long journey. We made many things, many mistakes along the way. I'm also writing an article this time, well, these days, about, well, some of the lessons that we learned. And I want to leave you with something that's kind of a story of my life over the last 18 months, because it doesn't matter what you do and how you build it and how you design it, you will never get it just right. So this, my friends, is the story of my life. And can we please turn on the audio? Anybody? Audio? No? No audio? It's coming? No, it's not coming. Oh, maybe I should change the thing here. Just a second. Oh, headphones. Let's try. It's coming? No. Sad. I just have to turn this off then. Oh, so sad. But I have cats. That's okay. Many, 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 many cats. So this is mine. Thank you so much for coming. Sorry for overrunning. I hope you'll have a good lunch. And if you have any questions, please come to me and talk to me. I'm here. So meow with this in mind.